This video is about the DC animated movie universe, which is a subset of the DC Universe animated original movies series, which is distinct from, but has occasionally overlapped with, the DC animated universe. The DC animated universe began in 1992 with the debut of Batman the Animated Series, and also includes Superman the Animated Series, and Justice League Unlimited, along with a few other spin-off series like Batman Beyond and Static Shock. The DC Universe Animated Original Movies line began in 2007 and consists of animated movies that are released directly to home video. Most of the DC Universe Animated Original Movies do not take place in the DC Animated Universe, but a couple do. 16 of the DC Universe Animated Original Movies are set in the DC Animated Movie Universe, which is a separate universe from the DC Animated Universe and the universes in which the other DC Universe Animated Original Movies take place. Confused yet? Welcome to the wonderful, horrible experience of being a DC Comics fan. The DC Animated Movie Universe began in 2013 with the release of Justice League: The Flashpoint Paradox. While this is considered the start of the DCAMU, it's really more of a prologue that explains where the DCAMU came from, what it is, and how it came to be. Sort of. The first film to be set entirely in the DCAMU is Justice League War, which came out in the following year of 2014. It's with this film that we get our first real impression of what the DCAMU is going to be like. The character designs, the voice cast, the tone. Many of the characteristics that set the DCAMU apart from the DCAU and other DC animated projects are adapted from the New 52. The rebooted DC Comics continuity that was introduced in 2011. For example, Superman's costume in the DCAMU is clearly based on his present-day look from the New 52. Also, Superman and Wonder Woman are dating, just as in the New 52 comics. And of course, the New 52, like the DCAMU, was depicted as being the result of the events of a story titled Flashpoint. But for all the inspiration it draws from the New 52, there's a lot that the DCAMU takes from earlier eras of DC Comics as well. The series includes adaptations of several pre-New 52 comic stories, including Teen Titans: The Judas Contract, a two-part adaptation of The Death and Return of Superman, and Batman Hush. And it contains a few ideas all its own. For example, it streamlines Batman's backstory, eliminating the characters of Jason Todd and Tim Drake completely, depicting Batman as having only two Robins, Dick Grayson, who has grown to become Nightwing in the present day of the series, and Damian Wayne, Bruce Wayne's son with Talia, the daughter of Ra's al Ghul. But that's all surface stuff. Not that it doesn't matter. It does. But the important question about the DCAMU is it any good? And the answer is, kinda. Sometimes. Not really. It has its shining moments. It has its drawbacks. Ultimately, I think the drawbacks win, but let me talk about both. First, the drawbacks. The DCAMU is aimed at a more mature audience, and by that I mean teenagers who want to hear cuss words and see boobies. The attempted maturity of the DCAMU revolves so heavily around profanity and TNA that at times it feels like it was written by some of those same teenagers. I mean, look at how they draw Zatanna, for God's sake. She doesn't even have a jacket. Is that character design based on something Jim Ballant came up with in 1993? The horny/edgy teenager version of maturity exhibited by the DCAMU gets annoying at times. So does the series' single-minded fixation on Batman. And I say this as a Batman fan. I love Batman, but damn, there's a lot of Batman in the DCAMU. Of the 16 films in the series, 4 are Batman movies. And the 5 Justice League movies tend to feature Batman pretty prominently as well. I remember reading an interview with Bruce Timm when they were making the Justice League cartoon back in the early 2000s, or maybe it was Justice League Unlimited, I can't remember, one of those two, and Timm talked about how they had to remind themselves not to use Batman so much, Because all the writers loved Batman and wanted to tell Batman stories, but the show wasn't Batman, the show was Justice League, so not every episode could be about Batman. So they made a conscious effort not to feature Batman too prominently. It seems the producers of the DCAMU made no such effort. Batman gets a lot of time in the series, way more than any other member of the Justice League. Superman? Leader of the Justice League, champion of Earth, Man of Steel, etc. He only gets 2 solo movies in the entire series, and they're the 2 parts of the Death of Superman adaptation. The Flash, who is responsible both for creating the DCAMU and ultimately for resetting it again at the end of the last film, no solo films in the series. There is the Flashpoint movie, but as I said, it's mostly a prologue to the main action of the DCAMU, and anyway, that's branded as a Justice League movie. Wonder Woman? 1 solo movie, and it's the second to last one in the series. It's like they were just about to turn out the lights when someone said, "Oh shit, we haven't done a Wonder Woman movie yet." Maybe they'd have had more time for Flash and Wonder Woman and others if only they hadn't done 4 Batman movies, 3 of which are not even actually about Batman, but rather his shitty son Damian, who the producers try so hard to turn into a breakout character, and it never works. I know you wanted justice, not vengeance to get over as a catchphrase, but it didn't happen. It's never gonna happen. It's not that all the Batman stuff in the DCAMU is bad. Some of it is alright. The creators make a couple of choices that are at least interesting on paper. Besides trimming back the number of Robins, we hardly ever see the Joker, and Ra's al Ghul is killed off permanently in his very first appearance, so at least this version of Batman doesn't lean on the same crutches as a lot of other versions. But even when the DCAMU looks like it's on the cusp of doing something really interesting and satisfying with Batman and his supporting cast, it winds up dropping the ball, as is the case with the third of the 4 Batman movies in the series, Bad Blood. For about the first 2/3 of it, Batman Bad Blood is the best Batman movie in the DCAMU, and one of the best movies in the series, period. Bad Blood sees Dick Grayson taking over as Batman after Bruce Wayne is captured by the League of Assassins. The story also introduces the characters of Batwoman and Batwing to the DCAMU, and they both work pretty well, although Batwoman, in her civilian identity as Kate Kane, does suffer from a bit of the same horny teenager character design problems as Zatanna. She spends a crucial scene in her underwear for no legitimate reason whatsoever. As you might be able to tell, I'm not really a fan of the Damian Wayne character. His diminutive stature, nasally voice, peevishness, and completely unearned facade of self-confidence give him a Ben Shapiro vibe that is naturally extremely off-putting. But then again, to be fair, Damian is shown to be good at things, which definitely cuts in the opposite direction. But the dynamic between Damian and Dick works really well here. They're naturally antagonistic, with Damian as the know-it-all little twerp obsessed with what he believes to be his birthright as Batman's biological son, and Dick as the older, wiser, but not that old and not that wise adopted son, trying to fill Bruce's shoes while also following his own path and keeping Damian in line. As the story moves along, they gradually develop a grudging sort of mutual respect. The new characters are introduced efficiently and have parts to play in the story that feel logical and allow us to get a sense of who they are and why we should care about them. And when this newly assembled Bat family converges on the remote castle where Bruce Wayne is being held prisoner by the League of Assassins, the result is an action sequence that is fun, easy to follow, exciting, and all in all pretty satisfying. And then the movie goes on for another 25 minutes. In the last act, the plot takes a sharp turn toward the nonsensical. The Bat team scrambles to foil an evil scheme to brainwash world leaders at a summit meeting, the sort of cliched supervillain plot that feels better suited to Roger Moore's James Bond than to Batman. Things also get super misogynistic. Or Bat misogynistic, I guess. Gotta keep the branding straight. The villain of the film is Talia, daughter of Ra's al Ghul and mother of Damian. We've seen Talia before in the DCAMU. She appears in Son of Batman, the first solo Batman film in the series where Damian is introduced. But her characterization here in Bad Blood is a huge problem for me. First, while in Son of Batman she's shown to be morally conflicted, neither hero nor villain, now in Bad Blood she's become unambiguous, pure evil. Even her love for her son, which was one of her primary motivations in her previous appearance in the series, and which compelled her to leave Damian in Bruce's care for the boy's own safety and well-being, is gone. At one point, she not only rejects Damian, but orders Bruce, who, in a shocking twist, is under her mind control, to kill him. It's not the inconsistency with the earlier film in and of itself that I have a problem with. Even within a series set in the same shared universe, I'm more than willing to overlook inconsistencies as long as the story is good. But Talia's characterization in Bad Blood makes her a far less compelling character. Instead of a conflicted character torn between her love for Bruce and their son and her feeling of responsibility for her father's potentially destructive legacy, Bad Blood turns her into a one-dimensional supervillain bent on using technological mind control to establish world domination. It's shallow, lazy, and boring. Second, Talia's role in the film, as far as Batman goes, is to be the woman who comes in, literally brainwashes him, and turns him against his almost entirely male group of friends and family. No one comes out and says it, of course, but when Nightwing and Robin are appealing to Batman to fight through the psychological conditioning, break away from Talia's control, and take his rightful place back by their side, their pleas have a distinct bros before hoes ring to them. So, the tacked-on wacky supervillain plot and gross retrograde sexism spoil what was otherwise a pretty decent little Batman movie. That's a shame. But fortunately, there are a couple of movies in the DCAMU that manage to be good all the way through, and it just so happens that those two movies are the two halves of the DCAMU's adaptation of The Death and Return of Superman, titled, respectively, The Death of Superman, kind of a no-brainer there, and Reign of the Supermen. Both movies do a good job of condensing the Death of Superman storyline from the comics and adapting it so that it fits within the specific continuity created by the DCAMU. As The Death of Superman begins, Superman and Wonder Woman have ended their relationship, freeing Clark to fall in love with Lois Lane. To its credit, the movie doesn't just forget about the Supes Wonder Woman relationship, but acknowledges that they broke up off-screen at some point, and shows Lois and Diana forming a tentative friendship of their own. The movie also shows Superman and Wonder Woman still being close friends, and uses that to solid dramatic effect. Wonder Woman is one of the heroes who squares off against the apparently unstoppable Doomsday before Superman arrives on the scene. She takes a beating, and when Superman shows up, she tells him gravely, "Don't hold back. If you don't stop him, he'll kill everyone." That moment lands exactly the way it needs to. It brings home the stakes of the fight, it plays on the bond between Superman and Wonder Woman that's been previously established. It's great. The fight between Superman and Doomsday that ensues is suitably epic without feeling repetitive or going on too long, and the resolution, which sees Superman kill Doomsday before falling himself, is staged in such a way that Superman's victory happens for reasons that are clear and make sense. He flies into Doomsday's jaw at super speed, breaking the monster's neck, but winds up fatally impaled on one of Doomsday's spikes. You gotta watch those. Reign of the Supermen sees the emergence of 4 new heroes who seek to fill the vacuum left by the death of the Man of Steel. Some of them are more Supermanish than others, and one of them, spoiler alert for this movie and also for 30-year-old comic books, Cyborg Superman, turns out to be a bad guy who wants to use technology to mind control people in order to establish world domination. What is with that? Are there no other supervillain plots? Doesn't anybody want to hold the planet hostage with, like, a deadly virus anymore? What, too soon? Anyway, Cyborg Superman's plot isn't exactly the same as Talia's in Batman Bad Blood, because it turns out Cyborg Superman is working for Darkseid, about whom I'll have more to say in a minute. Luckily, Superman, the real Superman, isn't actually dead. just regenerating, and he wakes up and gets back into action in time to defeat Cyborg Superman and save the world. Neither of these movies is a classic by any stretch of the imagination, but they're both good, especially when judged relative to the rest of the DCAMU. The pacing is mostly very good, there are some nice character beats between Clark and Lois, and Supes and Wonder Woman, and the cast does a good job. I particularly like Rainn Wilson as Lex Luthor. Most importantly, this two-part story gets Superman right. During his slugfest with Doomsday in the first half, we see him stopping to protect people, to get them to safety. Unlike his live-action counterpart in the DC Extended Universe, this Superman actually behaves like he gives a shit about others. These movies know that being a hero is about more than winning fights with villains. It shows us a Superman who cares and who acts like it. When Superman dies, or appears to die at the end of the first part, and we see the world mourning his loss, it plays as genuine. It makes sense, given what we've seen of him, that people would be saddened by the death of this Superman, that his memorial service really would feel like a funeral for a friend. The movie has emotional weight. Its big emotional beats hit just the way they need to. And after being sidelined for most of the DCAMU, it's nice to see Superman treated with the respect and importance that he deserves. There are only 3 films left in the DCAMU after Reign of the Supermen. One is a competent but forgettable adaptation of Batman Hush. One is the one and only solo Wonder Woman movie, which gets off to a shaky start, is pretty solid through the middle, then kinda falls apart in the last act, though not to nearly the degree that Batman Bad Blood does. And then there's the last entry in the series, Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. Justice League Dark Apocalypse War is not a very satisfying ending to the DCAMU, but it's an appropriate one for a few reasons. First, it prominently features the character of John Constantine, who is one of the central characters of the entire series, behind only Batman and Damian in terms of amount of screen time and importance to the overall narrative. Second, it's a bookend, making a pair with the first film set entirely in the DCAMU, which is titled Justice League War, and which also features the Justice League facing off against Darkseid. And third, since Darkseid represents an existential threat, this last entry in the series is an all-hands-on-deck situation, with virtually every heroic or quasi-heroic character seen in the previous DCAMU films making an appearance. Oh, and it literally brings the series full circle, which is actually kind of a problem in this case, but I'll get to that in a second. There are other problems I want to talk about first. Starting with Darkseid, the most boring villain ever, who the producers of DC Comics adaptations just can't seem to let go of. Here's a quick test to determine if the version of Darkseid you're looking at sucks. Is it drawn by Jack Kirby? If the answer is no, it sucks. The most interesting thing about Darkseid is that he was created by Jack Kirby. Without Kirby's visual genius and boundlessly intelligent and idiosyncratic imagination to bring him to life, Darkseid becomes a generic alien warlord with dreams of galactic domination. He's a big, mean guy with a scary voice who makes a lot of grandiose, empty threats before he loses. There are dozens of more interesting DC Comics villains for Superman and the Justice League to fight, one of whom is a giant starfish. Thank you, James Gunn, for recognizing Starro's potential. And I am baffled and annoyed by Darkseid continuing to be the default choice for the final boss of stories like this. Anyway, Darkseid sucks and he's boring and one-dimensional, but the writers of Apocalypse War do come up with a couple of twists that are at least a little bit interesting. Or rather, it's the same twist. They just use it twice. The twist is, the heroes fail. The first big action scene consists of the Justice League traveling to Apocalypse for a throwdown with Darkseid, and they lose. The rest of the movie takes place in the aftermath of their failure as the weakened, broken, but determined surviving members of the Justice League regather their forces in a last-ditch attempt to drive the forces of Darkseid off of Earth and save the planet. And they succeed. Kinda. They defeat Darkseid, so he won't pose a threat again in the future, but Darkseid's operations to mine energy from the planetary core have done so much damage that Earth is doomed anyway. Billions of people are still going to die, and there's nothing the heroes can do about it. So ultimately, despite their best efforts, at the end of the movie, the heroes have lost for the second time. Kind of a bummer. But then we come back around full circle. Remember I told you that the DCAMU, like its print inspiration, the New 52, was created out of Flashpoint, when the Flash used his speed powers to travel back in time and change history. Well, at the end of Apocalypse War, faced with inevitable catastrophe, Constantine slides over to Flash and essentially asks him to hit the reset button, which the Flash does, thereby closing down the DCAMU on the same note with which it opened. And I don't know, the series had obviously run out of gas by this point, so I suppose this was as good an ending as any they could have come up with given the circumstances, and the full circle aspect does have some appeal in theory, but it's difficult for a story to have any gravitas when it's within the power of the characters to rewrite their own reality if things don't go their way. At no point was the DCAMU all that great, but even so, this ending is kinda sad. Apocalypse War concludes with Flash racing off into the horizon to reset the timeline, while the rest of the heroes watch as their reality is consumed by white light, standing along a shoreline looking at each other like, well, this is it, I guess. So, what happened? How did the DCAMU come to such an underwhelming end? How did an ambitious project to adapt a just rebooted comic book line and attempt to recapture the magic of the highly acclaimed DC animated universe with something fresh and new wind up just kinda fizzling out and being instantly forgotten? I think a large share of responsibility belongs to the source material that was the initial basis for the DCAMU, that much ballyhooed 2011 DC Comics reboot, The New 52. The New 52 was the result of DC's second major reboot of its fictional universe, the first being 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths, which resulted in what is usually referred to as the post-crisis DC universe, the setting of most of the DC comics people my age grew up reading in the late 80s and into the 1990s. Just as the Crisis was meant to clear out the clutter that had accumulated in DC's in-world history and continuity over the previous several decades, this second reboot was meant to simplify and clarify things that had happened in the 25 years that had passed in the real world since the Crisis. This second reboot, which followed the conclusion of the original comics version of Flashpoint, also gave DC an opportunity to relaunch its entire line of titles, many with new creative teams, in an attempt to revitalize its long-tenured marquee characters and boost sales by offering new readers a clear jumping-on point. The relaunched post-Flashpoint line consisted of 52 ongoing monthly titles, hence the New 52. There was a lot of excitement about this amongst comic book fans at the time, and also quite a bit of skepticism. DC has become justly infamous for obsessively fussing with its continuity, but initially the New 52 seemed like a gamble that was going to pay off. Buzz around several of the most prominent relaunched titles was positive, and sales did increase. At first. By the end of the year, sales of DC monthly titles had returned to their previous levels, but the company seemed committed to the New 52 branding and the rebooted fictional universe it represented. So, when Warner Bros. Animation decided to launch a new shared universe within its DC Universe animated original movies line, it made sense to base it on the New 52. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess. Depends on how you felt about the New 52, doesn't it? DC's commitment to its freshly rebooted universe didn't last very long. Beset by flagging sales, growing concerns from fans and critics regarding the quality of the stories, and larger issues, such as the treatment of female characters and the lack of women hired as creators on the books, and increasingly public conflicts between editors and creative teams, DC ended its New 52 branding in 2015. The following year, DC rebooted its fictional universe again. That would be for the second time in 5 years, with another company-wide crossover, Rebirth, which reversed many of the changes brought about by the New 52. The end of the New 52 in the comics left the DCAMU as something of a relic. Despite it only being a few years old, it had outlasted its source material. Once reflective of the shiny new image of DC Comics, now its modernized character designs, stunted adolescent sensibilities, and recurring blatant sexism felt conspicuously out of date. Well, okay, we're talking about superhero comics, so those last two are probably always going to be sadly in fashion, but you know what I mean. The DCAMU carried on for a while, tried to recalibrate a bit. If you look at the latter half of the series, you find that it draws less direct inspiration from comics published in the New 52 era. The latter portion of the series is where we find the adaptations of The Judas Contract, The Death and Return of Superman, and Hush, all well-known stories published long before the New 52 reboot. The DCAMU also jettisoned some of its more obvious visual ties to the New 52. When he returns to action at the end of Reign of the Supermen, Superman has switched costumes to one that more closely resembles the one Henry Cavill wears in the DCEU movies. Which isn't much of an improvement, honestly. Can someone get this man some red trunks, please? Batman Hush and Wonder Woman Bloodlines also write in costume changes for their respective heroes, discarding their previous New 52-inspired looks. When the Justice League gathers on the Watchtower before their first attack on Darkseid at the start of Apocalypse War, you can't even tell that this series began as an adaptation of the New 52 specifically. But even with those adjustments, once DC Comics abandoned the New 52, the DCAMU's days were numbered. While reviews for some of the films in the series were good, none of them were regarded as especially outstanding, and if you look at the sales figures, you find that the films that were part of the DCAMU didn't do any better than the other DC Universe original animated movies that have been released since 2007. None of the 16 DCAMU titles cracked the top 10 in domestic sales of the DC Universe original animated movies. Only 3 place in the top 20. The best-selling DC Universe original animated movie released after the DCAMU was introduced in 2014 is the widely reviled adaptation of Batman the Killing Joke that came out in 2016, which is not a part of the DCAMU. The fact that the movies of the DCAMU didn't sell particularly well is ultimately the reason why it was abandoned, but I think there's another reason why it failed to make much of an impression, and why today, 8 years after it began and just over a year after it ended, it's been all but forgotten, and that reason is, it's just not that good. It was a good idea, bringing the freshly rebooted versions of some of the most recognizable comic book superheroes to life in a new animated shared universe, but a good idea isn't worth much unless it's well executed. The Marvel Cinematic Universe was a good idea too, but the only reason it's lasted this long and made such an unfathomable amount of money is that most of the movies and TV and streaming series that have been produced under its umbrella have been regarded as at least pretty good. However strong the initial concept is, if your shared universe is made up of a bunch of mediocre movies, what you end up with is a mediocre shared universe. And that's the DC animated movie universe in a nutshell. Just make good movies. It's that simple. In fact, I'll prove it. I'm going to write up a pitch and send it to Warner Brothers Animation, telling them why they should reboot the DCAMU and put me in charge of it. Yeah. I'll fix all the mistakes that they made the first time around. Step 1, get rid of Damian Wayne. Bring back Tim Drake. He was my favorite Robin. Anyway, in fact, I'll make Tim Drake the central character of the whole series. I'll call it the Timverse. No, shit, that doesn't work. A lot of people call the DCAU with Batman the Animated Series and Justice League and such the Timverse because of Bruce Timm. That'll be confusing. So, instead, my rebooted DCAMU will revolve around Tim's predecessor, Batman's original Robin, Dick Grayson. And it'll be called the Dickverse. Yeah, I like that. No issues there whatsoever.